Hello, my name's Tim Storer. I'm the director of SICSA, and I'm going to talk about how to examine a reverse Viva. So the first thing we should talk about is why do we conduct Vivas of research theses in the first place? And what we're trying to do is test that a candidate, a research student, has a thorough knowledge of the relevant literature within their chosen field. So what we want to have by the end of the PhD process is for the candidate themselves to be the world expert in the narrow area of research that they have chosen to pursue and describe in their research thesis. So they should become, if you like, more expert in that material than either their PhD supervisors or indeed the examiners, and they should be able to demonstrate that mastery of the literature. We also want to confirm that the person sitting in front of us as examiners is the person who actually undertook the research in the first place. And in almost all cases, that's definitely true. But the part of the process of the Viva is just validating that fact. So the person in front of us is the one who read the literature, synthesized it, that designed the research methods, gathered the results, analyzed those results, and presented their conclusions and developed the analysis of limitations and so on. It's really this person who has become the mastery of this research. We also want to establish the novelty of the research contribution described in the thesis. And you may think that that should be a given, it should be stated explicitly in the thesis as part of any submission. However, sometimes in my experience, the real novelty or interesting aspects of a piece of research are often missed by the candidate. Or perhaps misaligned, and they don't necessarily notice the most important things about what they've done. So part of the PhD process is just to establish and confirm the candidate's thinking about which aspects of the work are most interesting, most novel, and are likely to have the most impact for different audiences, whether that might be other researchers, society, industry, and so on. Finally, one sort of side comment is that a Viva should be rigorous. We want to really test that the candidate has done the work and so on. But we shouldn't go in with the mindset that we're trying to catch a candidate out with tricky questions or trip them up in some way. Our default expectation by the time that a PhD thesis has been submitted and sent for examination is that the student is ready to pass the Viva, and that we're engaging in the Viva process to confirm, really to confirm the work that has been done, um, and have an interesting discussion about the great research that they've undertaken, and explore that research with the candidate, rather than asking sneaky questions. That's not really of good value for either the examiners or the process or the candidates. So why do we want to do a reverse Viva? So a reverse Viva is an opportunity for research students such as yourselves to act as an examiner for an established academic on their PhD thesis. And the reason to do that is we want to encourage you as examiners, but also the wider audience who will be listening in, to think about the purpose of the Viva and practice developing the questions that examiners ask in Viva, so that when you come to your own PhD research Viva, you'll be able to anticipate the kinds of questions to expect for your own research and prepare for them accordingly. So we want to demystify the process and ensure that you're perhaps a little less threatened by the mystique surrounding a PhD Viva, and are better prepared for it as a consequence. So how do we run a research Viva, a reverse Viva? Well, first of all, we need a candidate, and we normally pick somebody who's an early career academic, so that their PhD thesis that has been accepted is relatively recent. We look for some examiners who are research students, such as yourselves, and we also have a convener in the group, and their role is to act as a neutral arbiter of the PhD Viva process. So they'll ensure that the examiners have opportunities to ask questions, the candidate has an opportunity to answer, and can also ask for clarification of questions if they're unsure what is being looked for, and also that the candidate has a fair opportunity to present their work. Normally, the tone and conduct of the Viva is very positive, but a convener acts as a potentially as a safeguard against a student receiving unfair questions. And finally, there'll be in a reverse Viva, unlike in a normal UK Viva, an audience of mostly silent research students watching the process unfold. So how do we prepare as examiners for a Viva? So we'll have invited the candidate to submit themselves for examination and ask them to send us a copy of their PhD thesis. When they do that, we ask them to send us one or two, or select one or two chapters from that thesis on which they would like to be examined. And we send that to you as the examiners, notifying you of which chapters are of interest, along with the entire thesis as well for you to read. Sorry, for you to browse. So we only ask you as examiners to read through one or two chapters that have been nominated by the candidate, but you do have access to the entire thesis should you want to browse other sections or check up on particular references, for example. And your job as examiners during the preparation phase is to prepare suitable questions for the candidate so that you're ready in the Viva. We'll look at questions in a second, but the next thing we should just look at quickly is how we're going to set up the reverse Viva. So we're going to set up the entire room for the audience in theatre style. So there'll be rows of chairs for the main audience to sit in, and then a stage at the front of the theatre is where the Viva will take place. And on that stage there'll be a table with some chairs around it. One side of the table will be chairs for the examiners and the convener, and on the other side will be a chair for the candidate who's being subjected to the grilling. We also provide a projector so that the candidate has an opportunity to give a short presentation about their research described in their thesis. So as I say, we have the examiners and the convener sit on one side of the table and the candidate sits on the other, so that they're facing sideways onto the audience, and you get that real slightly adversarial feel of a Viva, even though that's perhaps not really the tone that will emerge during the process. And at the first part of the Viva, the candidate is invited to give a short presentation about their research. And by short, we mean perhaps say 10 to 15 minutes as a reasonable amount of time for them to summarize the context of the research and present the key outputs, the key novel findings from their work, and potentially what any future work that they anticipate coming from it next. The examiners can dictate how long that presentation can last. So if you want it to be slightly shorter, you can ask the candidate to truncate their presentation. And indeed, if you feel that they're going on too long, the examiners through the convener can ask for the presentation to be brought to a close. That's not unreasonable, because we want to get to the interesting part, which is the opportunity to ask questions. So when you're preparing questions for your candidate, you want those questions to address the purpose of conducting a Viva. And for me, I think there's those three different aspects of the purpose of a Viva that you want to focus on first. So first of all, you want to determine that the candidate has developed the relevant expertise in their chosen field of research. They're familiar with the current literature and are masters of that literature. You want to test the authenticity of the work, so that means you want to determine that the candidate really is the person who conducted the research. They're authentic. It hasn't been done for them by somebody else, or been taken from somewhere else. As I say, that's very rare for that to arise. I don't think I've ever come across a case of that, but it is an important part of the Viva to determine that for yourselves. And one side note on that, of course, is that some PhD students may well get assistance with the writing of the PhD thesis. They might use proofreaders, or they might have reviewers or editors and so on to support them in writing clearly about their work. That's absolutely fine. Most candidates will declare that at the start of their thesis. But the important thing that we're really interested in is not whether they've written literally every single word by themselves without any support, but whether they're the ones who've done the fundamentally important and interesting work, like the research design, the reading and synthesis of the literature, and so on. That's what we're really caring about there. And finally, we want to, as I said a few slides before, we want to establish what the real novelty of the work is and confirm that with the candidate. A few things to bear in mind when you're developing questions is that asking general or generic questions is absolutely fine, particularly when you're wanting to ask warm-up questions for the candidate. So a generic question might be something like, tell me the most important aspect of your research, or what is the next and most immediate step in future work? And these are questions that can be asked across different PhD vivas, and they're absolutely fine, particularly, as I say, as warm-ups for the candidate before you get down into the details. It's fine to clarify points that you feel, it doesn't matter whether they really are, but whether you feel are vague or unclear. So if you feel that there are important details missing from a chapter's method description, you can ask for those additional details to be explained. The candidate should have that additional information accessible to them because they're the one who did the work. You want to check the legitimacy of weakly justified claims. That's often in earlier parts of the thesis where the context and motivation of the work is being justified, or perhaps early phases of experimental chapters. So, for example, I commonly see the assertion that humans are the weakest link in security of computer systems in lots and lots of research papers and in quite a few PhD theses. And that's a very general, wide, an undefended claim in most cases. So I normally spend some time with a candidate just teasing them a little by getting them to justify that claim and see that they need to perhaps tighten their writing around those sorts of assertions and defend themselves more carefully in those areas. But lastly, to end on a positive note, that perhaps the most important thing is to use the questioning to encourage the candidate to demonstrate that they are competent researchers through asking exploratory questions. So what if questions, what if you used a different method? This new research has just emerged since you submitted your thesis for examination. What impact is it going to have on your work? Those kinds of exploratory questions test whether the candidate is a master of their chosen field, that they have a good understanding of the interconnections, if you like, between their field of different bits of work within their field and others. But it also tests their ability to think about a research program that will proceed from the work that they have done. It's important perhaps to bear in mind here that any PhD thesis will go on for several years, and so research reported in that thesis might be 3 or 4 years old, and so inevitably may have been invalidated by more recent work from competitors. And bearing in mind the purposes of the thesis and the viva is to demonstrate the competency, the professionalism of the researcher, and to test and establish that. We're not necessarily looking for every single aspect of the research described to be still novel at the point when the thesis is submitted. Okay, that's almost inevitable. There'll be some dating going on. You need to bear that in mind as you examine the work. Okay, so what else? Let's have a look at some example questions quickly. So we can choose questions, for example, that test the candidate's critical analysis of the relevant literature. So often in a PhD thesis, you may find an assertion is made and a reference is placed at the end of it, but it's unclear in what way that reference supports the claim made in the PhD thesis. So it's useful at that point to then ask the candidate to explain what is the basis of their use of that reference in support of the claim. What evidence is there in the referred to work that justifies their own claim, and dig down into that in a bit more detail. You can test the underlying motivation or importance of the work. So I often see when I'm working as a convener working as a convener of a PhD theses, it's often interesting when an examiner who may not be as expert in the field as the candidate, often that's the case with internal examiners, can ask questions like, does any of this work really matter? Do the real people who are affected by this even notice the improvements or changes that you've made? And that can test the candidates thinking about the wider implications and context of their research, and to what extent they can make their research relevant to society or to the economy or so on. You can encourage the candidates to explain the context of the research, how they prioritize particular research questions. So, this can often come from things like just asking them why they decided to conduct a particular experiment, given the context of the previous work they'd already done, perhaps described in earlier chapters. And they may or may not, in the PhD thesis, have actually justified that decision for themselves by considering alternative options before they proceed in a particular direction. But getting them to think hypothetically about what other methods or approaches or other research questions they might have asked at different stages of their thesis and justify why they nevertheless chose the one they chose allows you to engage in an interesting discussion. Again, sometimes the output from that conversation could be that the candidate recognizes that um, an alternative research question or method might have been more appropriate. And again, that's absolutely fine from an examiner's point of view, because the candidate is therefore demonstrating their ability, when presented with new information, to critically reflect on that information and incorporate it into their new thinking. And that may or may not result in some minor changes to the thesis as a result. You can test the candidate's specific understanding of particular experimental methods. So you might want to get them to justify why a particular metric or test was used, perhaps a statistical test of some kind, to demonstrate they understood why they chose that particular method, why it's a good metric or test for the experimental results that they have gathered. Similarly, you might want to ask about whether, what's the legitimacy of the results based on the particular what's the validity of the results based on the particular method that they've selected. So maybe a good example is a PhD student I supervised many years ago, did all of his research within a single organization and had access to 10 to 15 people in any given study. And a definite weakness of his work was therefore that, it wasn't clear to what extent his work could be generalized. But one of the arguments he could make in defense of his approach was that the 10 to 15 people he was studying were the key relevant people within that organization. He essentially had a 100% sample of the relevant people doing a particular kind of work. And he wanted to study how they performed those activities. So it's getting the candidate to explore those issues with you as part of a discussion. You can test the candidate's understanding of the novelty of the work. For example, if they identify literature that appears to be very similar to their own work, you can ask them to explain the differences between what they've done and what was done in previous research. Um, um, or you can get them to explain what the most relevant literature was when they started their research and how they built on it. So you can ask questions that get them to justify, again, how did they arrive at the research questions that they decided to address. And I think I've already mentioned this idea of looking at missing details that may be just alluded to in experimental designs or results. So, for example, they might mention that they conducted a pilot study before they did their main study as a way of validating the approach. But they may not tell you in the PhD thesis what the differences were between the pilot study and the main experiment. What adjustments did they make, perhaps to a questionnaire or to some parameter settings in some software? What were the differences that they made and why? And how were those adjustments accounted for in the main study? What was the justification for them? You also want to get the candidate thinking more widely about the program of research that might emerge from their PhD thesis. So, what do you see as the long-term impacts of your research? Allows a candidate who's been very narrowly focused on the specific findings and methods and results of their own very narrow field to start thinking beyond that. Where will the research have influence beyond their own narrow field? Who else might be interested in the research and why? So getting the candidate to think about their research in the context of the wider discipline of computing science, or indeed beyond into other disciplines. Similarly, identifying relationships between research that they have done and that in recent papers by other academics or other researchers who are pursuing similar agendas. What's the interaction between them? Are there potentially collaborations, or are there complementary results between two different avenues of research that could be synthesized? Again, getting getting back to a generic question, what has changed in the field since you submitted your thesis? Testing whether the candidate has remained abreast of the recent changes in the literature since the thesis was submitted. So you may find that particularly well-prepared candidates will come with a set of 4 or 5 papers that they know they're going to have to insert into their literature review because the thesis has become a little outdated in the 3 months since they submitted it and the time of the Viva. So hopefully that gives you some guidance on to how to prepare for the Viva and what kind of questions you should ask as examiners. Just a few tips now about how to ask those questions when you're in the Viva. So the important thing is to let the convener control how the examiners ask their questions. That means the convener will invite different examiners to ask different questions, potentially allowing them to ask follow-ups before inviting the next examiner to ask a question about some other aspect of the work. So let the convener do their job by taking control of that flow of questions and giving fair opportunity to the candidate to provide answers. Having said that, be prepared to ask follow-up questions if you aren't satisfied with an initial response. Perhaps it's that the candidate hasn't fully understood the question you're asking and so hasn't given the answer that you're looking for. And so you can ask follow-up questions, perhaps phrasing the same question slightly differently or explaining where you think the misunderstanding might be so that you can get to the answer that you're actually interested in finding out. And of course, obviously, be courteous with that. There's, it can be tempting in a Viva context to where you've got a candidate who's nervous and who's acting defensively to become a little frustrated when you aren't getting to the interesting issue you really want to discuss constructively with this candidate who you think has actually done very good work. It's important to remain courteous, ask those questions politely, take breaks if you need to, ask for a little pause, or indeed, if you can't get to the answer, just perhaps hand over to another examiner for a while whilst you consider how to ask the question differently. At the end of the reverse Viva, if there's time, the convener can ask the audience to also ask any questions they would like to do so. That means that some of the pressure is taken off you as examiners. One thing to say at the end is that we should celebrate the candidate successfully defending their thesis. So we do that just like we would in a normal Viva. So the convener will ask the candidate to leave the room. We'll ask you as examiners to give a short discussion in front of the audience about the merits of the research and the performance of the candidate during that oral defense during the Viva. And then we'll invite the candidate back into the room and hopefully we get to congratulate them on passing the Viva and successfully defending their thesis. And we may relay a summary of the key positive points in the research back to them. Okay, so hope that was helpful and useful. I'm really looking forward to doing the reverse Vivas this year. And as I say, the important thing is to remember that this is, whilst also a learning opportunity, it's an opportunity to understand how the Viva process works. It's also intended to be a bit of fun and a relaxed atmosphere where we all get to do some learning. Okay, thanks very much.